So I've got an upcoming piece on Monster Hunter and how it does some things perfectly and other things so poorly I get mad, as well as an analysis of the 2D platformer Celeste and maybe the brawler Wolverblade and definitely the twin stick shooter Tower 57. But today we're going to take a look at a game that's often mentioned when people talk about their very favorites ever, and one that's almost always referred to whenever the subject of video games as art comes up. Last week the remaster of Shadow of the Colossus released, and I don't think we'll get another example of just how far games have come and just how much we now expect in a long time. We're going to look at what Colossus does so well, like its amazing art direction, the Colossus design and animations, the narrative style, graphics, presentation, music, clever puzzle platforming designs. It does do many things well. But we're also going to look at what it does not as well, like its camera, its controls, the player animations, signposting, and the actual moment-to-moment gameplay. And we'll examine reasons why the first game is recalled so fondly, and hopefully we end up looking at how several of the things that made the original so very memorable strangely hurt the experience of playing it today. This is probably the first video I'll make where a significant percentage of you will disagree with me, so let's keep in mind that none of these videos are talking about objective facts. These are all opinions. I'm a notoriously cranky old guy with no patience. I'm the dude who yells at stoplights for their obstinacy. And if I walk into a gas station and there are more than 3 people in line, I leave because I get angry in lines. But as an otherwise pretty average dude with average tastes, I think that makes my opinions pretty relevant to your average video game playing person. Of course, spoilers for a 10-plus-year-old thrice released game will follow. As always, if you like what I have to say, or how I sound saying it, help out a brother with a like, share, subscribe trifecta. Games grow up. It's impossible to discuss this game without touching on 2 things: the issue of video games as art, and how important camera controls are in modern gaming. Almost all of the writing in this game will reference it as a work of art, and whenever the debate about the artistic merits of video games as a medium is broached, Shadow of the Colossus is usually used as Exhibit A. I think it's pretty clear these days that video games can be art. In fact, I don't think it's possible to argue the other side anymore. But this was not always the case. Early video games were unambiguously a kind of toy. They were toys that adults occasionally played with, but for the most part, the people playing video games were the same people who were playing with G.I. Joes and Barbies. Kids. Because kids played video games, and video games were products that needed to be sold, most games were aimed at children and developed specifically to appeal to them. The golden age of the NES featured a tremendous library of brightly colored games with cute mascots. Even the horror-themed games were kids' horror. When I was a kid, almost 0 games even featured any blood. The popular, mainly for the gore, Mortal Kombat required entering a secret code to get any blood in the Sega Genesis version of the game. From Pac-Man through Super Nintendo, most video games, and almost all console games, were made for kids. But by the mid-90s, a large group of the kids who grew up playing video games were becoming adults who still wanted to play video games, creating for the first time a significant market for games with more mature subject matter. By the late 90s, a slew of games like Fallout, Half-Life, Metal Gear, Thief, and others had proved that the generation who grew up with Mario was going to keep playing games as adults. This adult market meant that games could take on much more adult themes, and while most of those games in hindsight were in fact works of art, the artistry was in the design of the gameplay systems, or in the way they told the story. The limitations of the hardware still meant that graphics were relatively crude, and the games weren't yet able to be truly cinematic. The cinematic game. The earliest video games had a fixed camera system because it was the simplest system to implement, and because the early consoles didn't have an input that could be used to control a camera. Into the early era of 3D games, this fixed camera system was able to be used to produce games that felt cinematic for the first time. Having total control of the camera means the development team can have the player see exactly what they want them to see. Resident Evil is an excellent example of this fixed camera being used to perfectly serve a game's goals. Much of the tension of that first game is a result of the cinematic camera angles that are used. Scenes were framed much like they are on movies and television. The developers used that to create fear in the player. Imagine that first Resident Evil if you could stop and swing the camera around corners, or into the spaces that are purposefully blocked from your view. It eliminates many of the scares. A fixed camera was best suited to a cinematic experience. But Team Ico's first game used this fixed camera system even though it was released on the first console to feature a controller with a second stick, finally making a fully free camera both possible and intuitive to the player in the console space. Ico used a minimalist sound design and open to interpretation narrative to create one of the first art house cinematic games ever released. The 3D puzzle platformer fixed the camera whenever the player entered a room, but as the player moved about inside a room, the camera would pan and swoop, producing an effect very similar to dolly or tracking shots in films. This movie-like direction took what might have been a rather dull puzzle platform game and turns it into something new and exciting and unlike anything most gamers had ever played. Many of these details were kept in the loosely connected prequel that Team Ico spent the next 4 years creating. Shadow of the Colossus released to almost universal praise, and it was instantly called an all-time classic and one of the first games to truly feel like a cinematic work of art. It was still, essentially, a puzzle platformer, but the grandeur of the spectacle and hundreds of small details combined to make the gameplay feel much more substantial than it actually is. Here's where we finally get to how the gameplay itself, and especially the camera system in Shadow of the Colossus, both make the game feel special, but also hold it back from being the true masterpiece it's credited with being. The rule of thirds. In the past, players were much more forgiving of wonky cameras because it was new and we had no experience controlling a camera with a controller. But we are decades into the era of fully controllable cameras now, and players require a high degree of precision. Wonky cameras can ruin games, and platformers especially require precise camera control to prevent players having to frustratingly repeat sections because their jump didn't connect due to an awkward or obstructed view. The Shadow of the Colossus is, at its heart, a puzzle platformer. It's a truly unique take on the genre, and so well designed visually that it's sometimes easy to lose sight of what it is, but what it really boils down to is a 3D platformer. Let's take a slow point-by-point look at what the actual gameplay of the title is, and explain how the camera helps and hurts the experience. Shadow of the Colossus achieves this cinematic spectacle through all the things you'd expect in any game. Lighting, sound design, art direction, animations, character design, all of that. But what sets this game apart from other games is its use of the rule of thirds. The rule of thirds is a principle of photography in cinema that deals with directing the eye of the viewer to the part of the frame the photographer or director wants highlighted. This set of guidelines is taught in almost all film and photography programs and holds that the human eye tends to split a frame into sections. As such, when composing shots, the photographer should dissect the frame into 9 equal sections with 2 horizontal lines and 2 vertical lines. Objects that are to be the focus of shots should ideally be placed at or near the intersection of these lines, or at least along one of the 2 horizontal lines. Why does a player character look so much more cinematic riding his horse than does Geralt of Rivia or Jack Marston? It's because Team Ico is using the rule of thirds and offsetting the player character to either the left or the right horizontal line of the frame. You have seen this in so many films and so many television shows and so many photographs that this framing technique is now in your head a de facto cinematic look. Anytime you see something framed this way, it's going to feel cinematic to you. Let's look at the difference in a normal video game where the protagonist is front and center. Let's take Geralt riding his horse. Watch this.
Radovid's realms, don't you mean? Temeria and Edirn are no more.
Radovid's pledged to
Now, that game is gorgeous. The lighting is perfect, the animations are beautiful, it looks great. But it just looks slightly less cinematic than what we're going to look at here. Let's look at the Wander in Shadow of the Colossus. See the difference? That's why the Wander looks more cinematic. Team Ico is using the rule of thirds and offsetting the player character to either the left or right horizontal line of the frame. That alone provides much of the cinematic feel of the game, but it doesn't end there. The game, like Ico before it, is constantly pulling back or zooming in or sweeping down in a simulated dolly shot. And this does in fact lead to breathtakingly beautiful moments, especially when riding the horse. And this worked perfectly in Ico because the fixed camera meant the areas were specifically and perfectly designed to accommodate those shots. But Shadow of the Colossus is a semi-open world game. Each encounter begins with the player using a sword as a beacon to direct him to the next Colossus. So this often requires quite a bit of searching and backtracking, most of which is done while riding the horse. Because these aren't straight routes to a destination, the player often needs to look around to find a cave or a tunnel or just get a bearing on where they are. And this is where the game's lack of a fully controllable camera and insistence on always offsetting the player frame left and panning and zooming the camera can lead to some annoyance. A fully controllable camera would make this entire process simpler and more efficient. But Shadow of the Colossus doesn't have a fully controllable camera because the game is absolutely dedicated to delivering a movie-like experience. So while riding at a full gallop through open fields, this camera is nearly perfect, delivering a fully cinematic experience unlike almost any other game in history. But when you need to go find that cave, or spin the camera around you to see if you pass something, or when you're riding in a narrow tunnel, things start to go awry. When you spin the camera around, Shadow of the Colossus won't leave it there for you. It'll pause for a moment before snapping back to the cinematic shot the developer wants. The illusion of freedom is totally broken for me in these moments, and I end up thinking, okay, I get it, your game is a movie and you want to direct my eye, but I want to look over there. In the narrow tunnels, this moving camera and player framing leads to bad controls and poor depth perception. And listen, as cranky as I am, if this was the only place this camera issue cropped up, we wouldn't be having this conversation. But again, Shadow of the Colossus is a platformer, and 3D platformers require precise cameras. A colossal pain in the ass. After you've found the Colossus you're looking for, the actual gameplay is relatively simple. It begins with a cinematic cutscene, then goes to a puzzle sequence, and moves into a stamina management platforming section before finally ending with another cutscene. Let's begin by saying that the beginning and ending cutscenes in the remaster aren't good. They are absolutely stunning works of visual art. The introductions, design, and animations of the Colossus are so fantastic that just watching them is entertaining. Hell, probably more entertaining than actually playing many of the platforming sections. After the cutscene, the player is given control back, and the puzzle is figuring out how to get onto the Colossus. The game does a pretty good job of slowly ramping up the difficulty of these puzzles, although the signposting can be pretty obscure on some. In particular, the two smaller bull encounters were obscure enough that even after looking up the answer, my response was, seriously? I was supposed to know to climb up and dislodge a fucking torch to back it off a cliff? But whatever. For the most part, the puzzles are hard enough to be interesting without being so hard they are annoying. They're well designed and quite clever, but after figuring out the mechanics, things get a bit dicey again. Once you've figured out what you need to do, it's time to actually get into the platforming. During these sections of the game, it does tone down its rule of thirds framing, but it doesn't eliminate it. The player is still slightly offset in the shot to maintain its cinematic feel. But 3D platforming with a player avatar that isn't in the center of the screen and using a camera that insists on snapping back to the shot the director wants framed can be a pretty frustrating experience. This is best demonstrated in the encounters that require using the horse. The game has coded the horse to be just ridiculously offset to the side of the frame, and the controls are terrible. Side note, this is not how horses work. You don't need to kick a horse 11 times to get it to canter. This offset and wonky camera, even when on foot, also means that judging jumps and distances is very difficult. The truth is that once you've figured out what to do, the rest of the game boils down to holding R2 when the Colossus shakes and moving when it does not. And the screen shake and animations during the climbing the Colossus again make the encounter fully cinematic in a way no other game does. But simultaneously, falling off of a Colossus because the camera angle makes precision impossible and having to do it all over again can be extremely immersion breaking. Half the battle in these sections is literally fighting to keep the camera from panning into a bad spot or getting caught on a piece of fur or a wall. It's often very difficult to judge where you are in relation to walls or parts of the Colossus that you need to jump to. Inevitably, this means you are going to, many times, attempt to jump only to realize that you weren't where you thought you were and plummet to the ground to do it all again. I've never had a camera lead to more disorientation in this game because it wasn't until I played this game that I realized just how used to being center frame I am in games. And that's the main issue here. Shadow of the Colossus is amazing because of how cinematic it is, and it feels that cinematic because of the way the camera angles are deployed, but that same system is what produces a bunch of the immersion-breaking frustration. And somewhere along the line, it becomes evident that the actual platforming is more spectacle than game. It's in the time challenges where this really is driven home. With the timer counting down in the corner, you need to not only know exactly what you need to do, but also be perfectly precise with your jumps, and the camera system simply can't handle that kind of precision. But beyond even that, the time trials show just how much of the actual gameplay here is simply holding a button down and waiting for the Colossus to stop shaking. Listen, I get it. The spectacle of the Colossus trying to shake you off is half of the experience. When under a time constraint, it made me even more frustrated than I got during the normal mode game. And let me reiterate, I am aware that I am old and cranky, but I cannot be the only one who after the 5th time I charged my sword strike only to have the Colossus shake, so I had to do it again, shouted, "Jesus Christ, I fucking get it, it looks like a movie, can I just stab it now?" I don't know. Maybe I am the only person who thought that. Let me know in the comments, I guess. I actually liked it. Okay, I've done the unthinkable and criticized a game that most people think is beyond reproach. So I think I should make it clear that I agree the game is very close to being perfect, and it does several things as well or better than any other game ever made. Shadow of the Colossus has an engaging narrative style and a story expertly told through everything other than dialogue. It is a masterpiece of the visual language of film, and that alone makes it a game worth playing. From the first time the player kills a Colossus, the tone of the music, the way the shots are framed, and the minimalist sound design gives an eerie feeling that something is not as it seems. It's no coincidence that the first Colossus you face isn't attacking you, it's ignoring you completely and walking away. And that moment when it finally turns and notices you is one of the most impressive moments I have ever had playing a game. It doesn't beat you over the head with a message. There are several ways to view the protagonist's actions, and its morality is left open for the player to interpret. It is a wonderful story and an expertly produced narrative that uses cinematic tools rarely used in games. And this remaster uses the power of current hardware to be absolutely gorgeous. The Colossi. The Colossi animations are perfect. The lighting and world design are engrossing, and the detail and art direction lead to top-notch environmental storytelling. But I can't help feel that more could have been done. I can't help feeling slightly let down. I can't help but feel that it needed just a bit more modern polish, and it needed to make concessions to the expectations of the 2018 player. The player animations are stilted and awkward looking. The mechanics of actually riding the horse are dated and frustrating and terrible. There is no defending the horse riding. But most importantly, it's the camera. It is hard to play a game with a camera that feels like it's from a PS2 game, which it is. If the player had simply been given complete control and the panning and zooming stopped whenever the player was trying to manually move the camera, a good chunk of my frustration would have been gone, and I had been focusing on everything I loved about the game and not the things that pissed me off. But I guess the game is such an untouchable masterpiece that a change like that just wasn't possible. Because if I had full control of the camera, I wouldn't be looking exactly where I was supposed to look, and how could the developers be sure I would fully appreciate their sweeping dolly shots? If I could leave the camera where I wanted, how could they be sure I'd frame the shot according to the rule of thirds? Is this a petty complaint? I guess. But I went to this game expecting near perfection because I'd never heard even a peep of criticism about it before. And the camera problems built from mildly irritating to downright frustrating by the time I got to the last extremely annoying Colossus. What should have been a culmination of the gameplay was like a mini expression of all the problems with camera control, wonky angles, and imprecise movement, and I ended up being happy it was over. I don't know. I'm pretty conflicted about this one. I can see why everyone loves it so much, and it is a work of art, but man, it was the least fun work of art I have ever played. Alright, I would be like a dog with two tails if you chased down my other videos. And if you caught those videos, I'd be grinning like the Cheshire Cat if you linked, shared, and subscribed. And if you did all that, I'd be as happy as a pig in slop if you taught me to sit. I'm always feeling antsy. Bye.